Good evening. It's great to be here. It's been a while. So tonight we're continuing our series on Paul's letter to the Galatians, and specifically the fruit of the Spirit, by looking at a life of goodness. We read about this in Galatians chapter 5, verses 22 and 23, where it says, "The fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law." The three questions I want to focus on tonight are: what is spiritual goodness? How do we cultivate a life of goodness? And why should we be good? I think it's important, before we look at what goodness as spiritual fruit is, that we start by looking at what it isn't. If you look up goodness in the dictionary, which I did, Bev will be proud of me, you'll find a definition like this. It's going to be on the screen. The personal quality of being morally good. And if you look up morals, you'll find that it says it's about the standards of good and bad behavior. So if you know the standards, the rules of good behavior, and follow them, you'll be a good person. Well, that's fine as far as it goes. And the spiritual fruit would certainly include this meaning. But what Paul is saying in this letter is that spiritual goodness goes far beyond this. More than that, if we try to be acceptable to God, be good Christians by obeying the rules, he says in chapter 5, verse 4, we'll actually be cut off from Christ and his grace. You see, the whole reason Paul is writing this letter to the Galatians is because they had welcomed people from a group who were going around the churches that Paul had planted among the non-Jewish communities, teaching that they must follow the law of Moses in order to be acceptable to God. They had accepted this message and begun, amongst other things, to get circumcised. And Paul is furious. In chapters 1 and 2 of his letter, he reminds them of the message he brought them, that they're saved by faith in Jesus and receiving his grace alone. He tells them of how this teaching was agreed by the apostles in Jerusalem. We then get to one of my favourite New Testament verses in chapter 3, verse 1, which is translated in the Kev as, "You stupid Galatians." And again in verse 3 he says, "How can you be so stupid? Do you think that by yourself you can finish what God's Spirit started in you? Have you gone through all this for nothing? Is it all really for nothing?" These are desperate words. You see, Paul knows better than most that the rules don't work. He was part of a religious group in Israel called the Pharisees, and the Pharisees followed the rules. In fact, they had more rules and better rules than anyone else, and they followed all of them in order to be good and acceptable to God. But far from producing in them the fruit of the Spirit listed in chapter 5, verse 22 and 23 of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, the Pharisees showed hatred towards those who didn't follow their rules. They were joyless, belligerent, impatient, unkind, according to Jesus in Matthew 23, evil, false, and violent. If the fruit of the Spirit is life, the fruit of keeping the rules religiously is death, which Paul affirmed in Romans chapter 7, verse 10. No wonder he's upset. At the other end of the spectrum from the Pharisees are people like me, for whom rules were made to be broken, or at least bent rather rigorously. Rules were the opposite of freedom and, quite frankly, cramped my style. So I tended to ignore them and do what seemed good at the time. But of course that doesn't work either. Paul says in chapter 5, verse 13, "My friends, you were chosen to be free, so don't use your freedom as an excuse to do anything you want." And in verses 19 to 21, "People's desires make them give in to immoral ways, filthy thoughts, and shameful deeds. They worship idols, practice witchcraft, hate others, and are hard to get along with. People become jealous, angry, and selfish. They not only argue and cause trouble, but they are envious. They get drunk, carry on at wild parties, and do other evil things as well. I told you before, and I'm telling you again, No one who does these things will share in the blessings of God's kingdom. So what Paul seems to be saying is, don't follow the rules, but follow the rules. Anyone confused yet? So what is goodness? The word for goodness in verse 22 in the original Greek is agathosune. Agathosune is a word which is only used in biblical writings at the time of the New Testament. I think, in fact, it's only used 4 times in the Bible in the New Testament. And it's a word created from the Greek root agathos, meaning benevolent and benefiting others. And one of its core meanings is goodness in the sense of character or virtue, a goodness that is a pattern of thinking and acting that runs right through someone, like the words in a stick of rock. So that wherever you cut into them, so to speak, you would find the same person through and through. It isn't a forced goodness or a joyless, automatic goodness that comes from obeying the rules, but rather a goodness that springs out effortlessly and seems naturally as a result of deep inner transformation. What Paul is talking about in this letter is nothing less than the heart of the gospel message. He's talking about the transformation that begins when someone steps into freedom by accepting Jesus and his free gift of grace. We receive his Spirit, who begins to lead us on a journey of discovering what it means to be truly alive, truly human, a journey that continues for the rest of our lives. So how do we cultivate a life of goodness? A good illustration of how we can do this is learning a second language. I'm a linguist. I studied 2 foreign languages at university and a third when I moved to Spain. I started, like most of us do, by learning a language at school. Having holidayed abroad most years with my family when I was little, I really enjoyed learning languages because I took an interest in the countries where they were spoken. At school, then at college, and in my first year of university, I learned a lot of rules for speaking these languages. I learned grammar rules for using verbs and forming sentences. I learned punctuation rules, pronunciation rules, spelling rules. So after 10 years of the finest education, the end result was that I really didn't speak either language at all. I knew a lot of rules about them. I knew what they should sound like. I could say a few sentences, recite a few set phrases to get by, but put in a conversation with a native and I was lost. What transformed this completely was when I moved to the countries where they were spoken, when thrown into situations where I was forced to use the language daily, driven by the need and desire to communicate, work and have friends in a new place. All that had come before suddenly came alive in me in a totally new way. But that is not to say that it was easy. When I finished university, I was led by God to move to Spain. I didn't speak a word of Spanish at the time, but I took a step of faith and I moved anyway. Once a decision had been made, it was a fairly easy move. Being a European citizen, I didn't need to pay for a visa. I could simply move, live and work in Spain as I could in the UK. I quickly settled in, loved the delicious food, fine weather and beautiful scenery. I remember having been there for only a couple of months and not having learned any Spanish yet, saying to my friend, I love it here. I could see myself spending a really long time here, or maybe even the rest of my life. The point being that at the beginning there was an instant change. A new world of exciting possibilities had opened up. But equally, if I wanted to belong in that place, if I wanted to be a part of the life of that place, there was a long journey of transformation still to come. I'd have to learn the language, have my ideas and worldview challenged by a different culture, a different way of doing things with which I was unfamiliar. And that bit was hard. I remember a few months later on the bus coming back from a Spanish lesson at the university. I was listening to a conversation in front of me in French, and suddenly I felt really upset and I cried out to God saying, Father, I understand every single word they're saying. I could join in fluently and speak like an adult, and here I am struggling on through with a language a 4-year-old would have mastered by now. Later, when I learned more, I got a job in a bar and got shouted at daily if I didn't understand an order. or mocked for every linguistic error I made. I hated that job, but I went every shift knowing that I needed to do this if I wanted to get fluent. After a few years, I finally started to get somewhere. What had been an effort and a struggle at first started to become second nature as my brain began to think and work in Spanish. I could meet friends and have conversations without thinking carefully about every word I wanted to say. I understood many of the cultural references and began to belong in the place. And of course, the greatest compliment, when I'd open my mouth and people would do a double take and go, "What? Are you from here? You don't look Spanish." This is an illustration of what it's like to develop character, to cultivate a life of goodness. When we accept our salvation by grace through Jesus, Paul says in Colossians chapter 1, verse 13, that we are rescued from the cold, rainy, grey kingdom of darkness and transferred to the warm, sunny, beautiful kingdom of light. But what we do when we get there matters. Although there's an instant wonderful change, our transformation is an ongoing choice that doesn't just happen automatically. Paul makes this clear with the last item on the list of spiritual fruit, self-control. If the fruit was automatic, why would we need self-control? We wouldn't. In Spain, there were many expats who moved there and made little effort to learn the language or integrate, preferring instead to spend their time with each other. They benefited from the environment and the snippets of culture that they engaged with, but they were only partially impacted by it, preferring to hold on to much of what they had supposedly left behind. As Christians, we too have to choose. If we want to cultivate a life of goodness, develop our character and discover more and more what it means to be truly human, we have to accept that it takes effort. There will be a hard journey ahead that will involve transformation as our minds and our patterns of thinking are renewed. We have to leave behind our old selves and our old lives as we strive for the life of God's kingdom. So where do we start? I think the key thing is to develop habits of the heart that allow the Holy Spirit to meet us in our effort and cultivate this fruit. Just like when learning Spanish, I went to classes twice a week. Organised language exchanges a few times a week, read books, watched films, went shopping, got a job. We need to discover the spiritual habits which will give us opportunities to grow and develop our character. And to do this, we need each other. You see, the fruit of the Spirit doesn't grow in isolation. It grows in community. These habits are things like prayer, Bible study, meditation, fasting, serving, worship, and celebration. They're disciplines that often require effort and deliberate planning if they're to happen. But the more we seek after God in these things, the more they become second nature to us and form in us a life of goodness that runs through to the core. In the House of Prayer community, we've begun a journey together, a pilgrimage of transformation. We've cultivated together rhythms of daily prayer, worship, and studying the Bible. We eat together, pray for each other, prophesy over each other, and listen to God together for each other, for our churches, and for our city. In city life, we have connect groups and discipleship groups with the aim of journeying together and developing habits that see the life of God's kingdom grow in us so that we can grow and become all that we're meant to be in God. If we're to see spiritual fruit grow in us, we need to be practicing these disciplines together. But we don't just need each other when things are going well and we feel like we're making progress. We also need each other when things go wrong and we lose our way. When this happens, we need to be able to talk to each other openly and honestly about it and help each other get back on track. I think there's often a barrier to this as we fear judgment. We feel we have to keep up appearances because we're among good people and we don't want to be looked down on or labelled a backslider. But Paul warns us about allowing that kind of attitude to creep into our communities in verses 25 and 26, where he says, God's Spirit has given us life, and so we should follow the Spirit. But don't be conceited or make others jealous by claiming to be better than they are. And again, in chapter 6, verse 3, he says, if you think you're better than others when you really aren't, you're wrong. None of us in this room are better than any other, no matter who we are or what we've done. His grace is extended to all of us, and it's only by his grace that we can have life. So we should rejoice when someone confesses where things have gone wrong and decides that they want to find their way again. Not because they did, but because they're making a choice to continue their journey again and step into greater freedom. We each help each other along the path, seeking to grow together into the people God has called us to be. This is what discipleship is. Now, being an English teacher, I have the joy of helping others along a path that I've walked many times. I have to confess that I often give my students rules or guidelines to follow while they're learning the language. Things like, only use one conjunction in a sentence, or don't start a sentence with a coordinating conjunction. These rules are not an end in and of themselves. And often, like this one, aren't rules at all for native speakers who can construct meaningful sentences with multiple conjunctions, or start sentences with coordinating conjunctions like I have. But they're there to keep my students heading in the right direction until they've reached a level of mastery so as to make them meaningless. If my students write sentences with only one conjunction, I don't say, well done, there's only one conjunction in your sentence. I say, well done. You've written some nice sentences which communicate what you want to say well. It's only when they come up with some garbled mess that I might say, you need to write in sentences. Follow this rule. So rules can keep us heading in the right direction as long as we have our eyes fixed on the goal of discovering our true humanity, freedom, and vocation in Jesus, and not simply on obeying the rules. How we cultivate a life of goodness together, then, is by practicing together the disciplines of the life of God's kingdom, teaching each other, encouraging each other, dispensing grace to each other when we go wrong, and guiding each other back to the path and onwards. Rules can sometimes help, but only insofar as they keep us heading in the right direction towards a life transformed. So what's the point of it all anyway? Why should we seek to cultivate a life of goodness? Why does it matter? To ask this is really to ask, what's the point of being a Christian? For a long time in the church, we lived with the misconception from the Middle Ages that the goal of our faith is simply to go to heaven when we die. This world is evil. God will rescue us and take us to a good place when we die. So all we're really doing is waiting around until that happens. And if that's what we believe, then it does lead us to wonder what the point of being good would be. But that is not the gospel. What Jesus made clear when he rose from the dead, what the apostles, including Paul, believed, is that with Jesus' resurrection, his kingdom had arrived, had invaded earth. When we receive Jesus, we begin our eternal life now. We enter his kingdom and become part of God's plan to see it advance, to cover every part of this earth, becoming, as we are transformed, the people that God always intended us to be from the beginning of creation. Paul makes it clear in many verses, like 1 Corinthians chapter 3, that how we live matters, and that what we cultivate, what we build now, will bear fruit both now and endure in the future life of God's kingdom. As Bev was teaching a few weeks ago, Paul warns us in chapter 6, verses 7 and 8, that you can't fool God. So don't make a fool of yourself. You will harvest what you plant. And if you follow your selfish desires, you will harvest destruction. But if you follow the Spirit, you will harvest eternal life. And it's not that death and destruction are some arbitrary punishment for breaking the rules, as if God were an angry judge just waiting for people to screw up so he can smite them. It's rather that death and destruction are the fruit of a life lived in this way. What he's basically saying is, don't make yourself look like an idiot by planting blackberries and expecting to grow an orchard of beautiful fruit trees. If you plant blackberries, you'll grow a field of brambles because that's how blackberries grow. And if we want the good fruit of the Spirit, if we want life to the full, we have to follow the Spirit, planting good seed and working hard to cultivate it and see it grow in our lives. As we do this, and as we grow in character and in goodness, we begin to see the purpose of this fruit in our lives. If we go back to the Greek word in this verse for goodness, agathosune, there's another core meaning. Agathosune is goodness which bubbles up and flows out of us to benefit our world. It's not a passive goodness that is just for our own benefit, but a goodness which aggressively seeks the good of God's rule on earth as it is in heaven, characterized especially by interest in the welfare of others. When I moved to Spain and I learnt Spanish, I obviously benefited greatly myself by being able to participate fully in the life of the community and culture around me. But that's not why I did it. I did it because I knew that God had called me there to be a blessing to the Spanish people. In order to be most effective in doing that, I needed to be transformed into a decent Spanish speaker. So it is with us, and seeking to cultivate the fruit of the Spirit in our lives. As we grow in character, we find that agathosune is goodness equipped at every level. It will become the very life of God's kingdom which flows out of us to bring God's rule to the people and to the places where we go. This is what we believe as a church. We have declarations up on the wall that we say together, believing that as we seek God together and are led by his Spirit, as we do the hard work of cultivating the fruit of the Spirit together, we'll be filled with all we need to bless our city and the nations. We believe that we will then see this flow out from us into the places we go, that as we go out from this place filled with God's Spirit, a people transformed, we put God on display in our workplaces, on our streets, in the halls of power and in our neighborhoods. We go to proclaim good news to the poor, release for those held captive, sight for those who are blind, freedom for those who are oppressed, and to proclaim that the grace and favor of our God is available to everyone. This is what it means to be truly human. To receive from the Spirit and then cultivate a life that is transformed by the language and culture of God's kingdom and poured out in worship to him, and then to see that life flow out of us to bless and transform the world around us. That's why we cultivate a life of goodness. So in a minute, I wonder if as a response we could stand together, if you want to, and make these declarations together again. And as we do, let's remember that this fruit of the Spirit is cultivated in community. We need each other. Let's consider how we're developing rhythms of life together, disciplines that will help us grow and become all that we're meant to be in God. And if you know you've lost your way a bit on this journey, or you just want to get on further, consider who you could talk to. It'll help you find your way again and journey with you. Let's recommit to our connect groups and discipleship groups and get involved if we aren't already. I'd also really encourage you to book some time in the prayer room at the House of Prayer from Friday night through all of Saturday, and spend some time just seeking God for his heart for our city. You're also welcome to join the House of Prayer community for a meal and a prayer once a fortnight on a Wednesday night. Just don't tell Rich I invited you. Shall we stand? So let's say these words together. As we gather together, we believe in God for heaven on earth, loving relationships and family created, prodigals returning, children and young people released, freedom, deliverance and salvation, faith, favor and courage, resources and finances unlocked, angels visiting and miracles created, dreams, visions and kingdom revelation, anointings, giftings and callings released, authority, positions and promotions given, healings and divine manifestations, and all we need to bless our city and the nations. As we go out, we are believing God for strategic partnerships with the city church and local government, creative solutions to the city's challenges, all areas of the city touched by God's presence. Many people delivered and saved in this city, a city of shelter for the refugee and stranger, no violence or bloodshed, the old and the young safe in the streets, the lonely being placed in families. Our city, a symbol and source of God's blessing, a city of wisdom and sound mind, faithful city, loving truth and justice, and known for peace and prosperity. Cities and nations coming here for God's blessing, local and international businesses bringing in wealth, young people arising and caring for nations, nations joining themselves to God, the city of God. Amen.